Please welcome Johnny Depp.
This is the first time I'm gonna call him Professor Krause because he doesn't like it when I call him.
If I get this story and I show it to you, will you then kindly disappear?
There are trials meant to decide guilt, and then there are trials that expose systems. This one did not begin in a courtroom. It began long before lawyers spoke, evidence appeared, or verdicts were debated. It began the moment reputation became currency. For years, something uncomfortable sat beneath Hollywood's surface, unspoken, protected, quietly understood. Power did not operate openly. It moved through whispers, alliances, silence, and fear. Careers rose or vanished, not always because of truth, but because of timing, narrative, and who controlled the story first. Then everything cracked, not because justice suddenly became pure, but because the process became public. What unfolded was not just a legal battle between two people. It was a rare moment when private machinery was dragged into the light, when accusation met amplification, when institutions revealed how quickly they distanced themselves from liability and how slowly they searched for truth. This trial forced people to watch something they were never meant to see: how narratives are chosen, how reputations are erased, how silence is rewarded, and how damage can be done long before facts matter. The most unsettling part wasn't the testimony. It was the speed. How fast doors closed, how fast contracts disappeared, how fast guilt was assumed without process. Because in Hollywood, protection doesn't always go to the innocent. It goes to the least risky. This story isn't about innocence or guilt. Not yet. It's about exposure. Exposure of how quickly public opinion replaces investigation, how morality becomes branding, how justice becomes optional when profit is threatened. And once this trial unfolded in full view, it became impossible to ignore the game that had always been played quietly behind closed doors. A game where truth is often the last thing anyone waits for. When the accusation surfaced, the industry did not pause. It reacted. Studios did not wait for evidence. Brands did not wait for clarity. Colleagues did not wait for process. Decisions were made at speed, not because truth had been established, but because risk had been identified. And in Hollywood, risk is managed aggressively. Johnny Depp did not lose roles through verdicts or findings. He lost them through distance, through silence, through the quiet recalibration of power that happens when institutions decide someone has become inconvenient. This is the first rule of the game. Perception moves faster than proof. Once a narrative takes hold, correcting it becomes exponentially harder. Accusations do not need to be proven to cause damage. They only need to be believed long enough for consequences to attach. And in Depp's case, those consequences arrived immediately. Projects disappeared, franchises moved on, public language shifted. The industry framed these decisions as responsibility, as caution, as moral alignment. But beneath the language was something colder and more pragmatic: insulation. Companies were not taking a stand for justice. They were minimizing exposure. Hollywood does not investigate. It calculates. This is where the trial's significance begins to widen beyond two individuals, because what happened to Depp was not unique. It was simply visible. A pattern many had experienced privately was now unfolding publicly, in real time. The pattern is simple. First, an allegation becomes a headline. Then the headline becomes a label. Then the label becomes reality. Process is optional in between. Once the label attaches, the burden reverses. The accused is no longer presumed innocent. They are presumed toxic. And toxicity is something corporations avoid at all costs. Not because it is wrong, but because it is contagious. So distance is created. That distance is rarely announced. It is enacted quietly. Phone calls stop, invitations disappear, statements are rewritten, and the person at the center feels the shift before anyone admits it has happened. Johnny Depp described this period as erasure rather than confrontation. There were no formal conversations, no clear explanations, just absence. And absence, when coordinated, is devastating, because you cannot argue with silence. This is the second rule of the game. Silence protects institutions, not individuals. By saying nothing, studios avoided commitment. By not taking sides publicly, they allowed public opinion to do the work for them. If the narrative shifted later, they could claim neutrality. If it didn't, they could claim alignment. Either way, they remained insulated. The trial forced people to confront how normalized this behavior had become, how quickly moral language is deployed when convenient, and how quickly it disappears when inconvenient. Justice was never the priority, stability was, and stability favors whoever controls narrative velocity. One of the most revealing aspects of the trial was not what was said under oath, but what had happened years earlier, when no one was watching closely. Contracts were terminated without findings. Roles were recast without explanation. Statements were issued that avoided specifics but implied certainty. This is where Hollywood's darkest game operates. It does not need to prove anything. It only needs to position itself correctly. Johnny Depp became a liability before he became a defendant. And once that happens, the outcome of any trial matters far less than people assume, because reputational damage, once embedded, does not reverse cleanly. This is why the trial mattered so much. For the first time, the process was visible. Evidence was examined publicly. Inconsistencies were challenged openly. Testimony was not filtered through press releases or legal summaries. It unfolded live. And as that happened, something uncomfortable emerged. The certainty that had driven years of decisions began to look fragile. This exposed the third rule of the game. Institutions prefer certainty, even false certainty, over uncertainty. It is easier to act decisively on incomplete information than to wait and risk appearing indecisive. Hollywood does not reward patience. It rewards alignment with whatever feels safest at the moment. The trial disrupted that comfort. It forced people to confront how little they had questioned, how much had been assumed, how easily moral narratives had been accepted because they fit the cultural moment. And it raised an unsettling realization. If this could happen to someone as visible as Johnny Depp, it could happen to anyone. Visibility does not protect you. It accelerates the process. The trial also revealed how public opinion can be weaponized unintentionally. Social movements designed to address real harm can be co-opted by institutions seeking cover. Support for victims becomes branding. Complexity becomes liability. Nuance disappears. Once nuance disappears, truth struggles to survive. This does not mean accusations should not be taken seriously. It means seriousness should include process. It means justice should not be outsourced to headlines. And it means careers should not be destroyed by implication alone. The trial did not deliver perfect answers. Trials rarely do. But it exposed the environment in which those answers are often pre-decided. An environment where reputations are managed like assets, where silence is strategic, where risk assessment masquerades as morality. Johnny Depp's case became a mirror, not just of a relationship, but of an industry that prefers distance to discernment. And once that mirror was held up publicly, it became impossible to unsee. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the most powerful force in the room was not evidence. It was narrative momentum. Long before testimony began, a story had already settled into public consciousness. Roles had been assigned, motives assumed, conclusions drawn. The courtroom was not starting from zero, it was fighting inertia. This is the fourth rule of the game. Once a narrative hardens, facts arrive late. Narratives don't just inform opinion, they shape interpretation. Evidence is filtered through what people already believe. Contradictions are dismissed as exceptions. Confirmations are amplified as proof. And in an environment like Hollywood, where reputation is both currency and collateral, this filtering becomes institutionalized. Johnny Depp's experience showed how quickly a narrative can replace process. Accusations moved through media ecosystems that reward immediacy over verification. Headlines were written before hearings. Commentary replaced investigation. Language framed outcomes before questions were fully asked. By the time legal proceedings began, the damage had already been done. This is where due process quietly loses ground, not because it fails in theory, but because it cannot compete with speed. Courts move carefully, narratives move instantly, And the gap between them is where reputations collapse. Hollywood understands this gap well. Studios and brands do not operate on verdicts, they operate on forecasts. They assess how a name will perform in the market tomorrow, not whether it will be vindicated years later. Waiting for legal clarity is seen as exposure, not prudence. So they act early. Contracts are paused pending outcomes. Statements are crafted to sound neutral while implying distance. Silence is maintained until the safest alignment becomes clear. None of this requires a judgment of guilt. It only requires uncertainty, and uncertainty in this system is treated as liability. The trial put this logic on display. As evidence was presented publicly, messages, recordings, timelines, many viewers experienced a kind of whiplash. The certainty they had absorbed did not align neatly with what they were seeing. Nuance re-entered the conversation, but it arrived into a culture that had already simplified the story. This created tension. Some doubled down on their initial beliefs, rejecting evidence as manipulation. Others began questioning how confidently they had accepted early narratives. The divide was not about loyalty to a person, it was about trust in process versus trust in story. And story usually wins. This is the fifth rule of the game. People defend the narratives that protect their identity. Admitting uncertainty feels like admitting error. Admitting error feels like complicity. So narratives are defended not because they are accurate, but because they are already integrated into how people see themselves and the world. Hollywood mirrors this behavior at scale. Institutions do not like revisiting decisions. Reversal implies misjudgment. Misjudgment implies liability. So even as the trial unfolded, the industry largely stayed quiet. Doors did not reopen. Apologies did not surface. The system waited. Waiting is strategic. If the outcome favored Depp, silence could be framed as neutrality. If it did not, silence could be framed as respect for process. Either way, the institutions avoided accountability for their earlier speed. This is how the game protects itself. Another unsettling element became visible: the asymmetry of recovery. Even if a narrative shifts, the damage does not rewind. Careers are not restored automatically. Trust is not rebuilt by verdict alone. The cost of early judgment is borne almost entirely by the individual, not the system that acted prematurely. The trial highlighted this imbalance starkly. As testimony unfolded, it became clear that the public spectacle had already replaced careful examination. Clips went viral out of context. Moments were memed. Complex dynamics were reduced to sound bites. Even the process of seeking truth became content. This is where justice collides with entertainment. When trials become spectacles, they serve two masters: truth and attention. Attention often wins, and attention thrives on conflict, not resolution. It thrives on sides, not nuance. Hollywood understands attention economics better than anyone. The same industry that profits from spectacle was now observing a spectacle that threatened its own practices. And rather than engage directly, it remained largely silent. Silence, once again, functioned as insulation. The trial did something rare. It slowed the story down. For weeks, the narrative could not move as quickly as it wanted to. Evidence had to be presented in sequence. Contradictions had to be addressed. Witnesses had to be questioned. This slowness created space for doubt, something early narratives had not allowed. Doubt is dangerous to systems built on certainty, because doubt forces reevaluation. Reevaluation forces responsibility, and responsibility forces change. This is why the trial mattered beyond its verdict. It exposed how quickly institutions abandon due process when it conflicts with risk management. It revealed how moral language can be used to justify speed rather than care. And it showed how difficult it is to reverse damage once a story has been allowed to run unchecked. Johnny Depp's case did not prove that accusations should be ignored. It proved that accusations should be handled with rigor, not reflex. That belief and investigation are not the same thing, and that justice requires patience in a culture addicted to immediacy. The darkest part of the game is not that mistakes are made, it's that the system is designed so mistakes are rarely corrected publicly. The trial cracked that design open. Not enough to dismantle it, but enough to reveal its shape. As the spectacle intensified, the focus kept drifting towards strategy, optics, and outcome. But buried beneath the arguments and the viral moments was something far less visible and far more permanent: the human cost of a system that acts first and reflects later. This is the part the industry never accounts for, because while narratives move quickly, damage settles slowly. Long before the trial gave Depp a public platform to respond, the private consequences had already taken hold. Professional relationships fractured without explanation. Long-standing collaborators disappeared. Projects dissolved without confrontation. The kind of erosion that doesn't arrive with a single blow, but with 1,000 quiet withdrawals. This is what institutional distancing looks like up close. No one tells you you're finished. They just stop calling, stop returning messages, stop including you in the future. That ambiguity is brutal because it leaves no clear enemy and no clear path to repair. You cannot argue with a system that refuses to speak. You cannot defend yourself against silence. And over time, that silence reshapes how a person sees themselves. Reputation is not just public image. It is internal orientation. When the world treats you as if you are already guilty, you begin carrying a weight that has nothing to do with legal truth and everything to do with social reality. People look at you differently. Conversations change tone. Assumptions replace curiosity. You feel it in rooms before anyone says a word. This is where the damage becomes psychological. The trial revealed how quickly someone can become isolated even while being constantly discussed. Visibility does not prevent loneliness. In many cases, it accelerates it. The more public the narrative, the fewer people are willing to engage privately. Association becomes a risk calculation, and risk-averse environments breed abandonment. Johnny Depp's testimony and demeanor often became talking points, but what mattered more was what wasn't visible. Years of existing inside a suspended state. Not convicted, not cleared, simply stalled. Waiting while the world moved on and institutions quietly adjusted around his absence. This limbo is one of the cruelest outcomes of narrative-first justice. It offers no resolution, only delay. And delay compounds harm because time does not pause. Careers decay, trust erodes, identity fractures. Even if vindication eventually arrives, it arrives to a life already altered. This is why winning a trial does not restore what was taken. The system does not rewind. Another rarely discussed cost is distortion of self-expression. When every word can be weaponized, people begin speaking defensively or not at all. Humor disappears. Spontaneity feels dangerous. Even authenticity becomes strategic. You stop being yourself and start being careful. That shift is subtle but corrosive. It teaches self-surveillance. It teaches restraint, born not of wisdom, but of fear. Over time, the person the world claimed to judge becomes a performance shaped by anticipation of judgment. This is not accountability, it is behavioral conditioning. The trial made this visible in moments where Depp appeared cautious, measured, hyper-aware. Not because he lacked confidence, but because years of misinterpretation had taught him that clarity does not guarantee fairness, and that lesson does not disappear when cameras turn on. Another layer of cost emerged in how relationships are remembered. When narratives polarize, history is rewritten, complex dynamics are flattened, context disappears. People choose sides not based on evidence, but on alignment with values they want to affirm publicly. Once that happens, reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. Because reconciliation requires acknowledging complexity, and complexity threatens certainty. Certainty is emotionally comfortable. It allows people to feel morally secure without examining process. But certainty built on incomplete information carries a price. The trial exposed how comfortable many had become with irreversible judgment. As evidence unfolded, some were forced to confront the gap between what they believed and what they were seeing. That confrontation was uncomfortable, and discomfort often produces defensiveness rather than reflection. So even as the trial progressed, many refused to update their views, not because the evidence was irrelevant, but because changing one's mind felt too costly. This is another hidden casualty of narrative-first systems, the erosion of intellectual humility. When belief becomes identity, admitting uncertainty feels like betrayal of self. And so people double down, institutions do the same. Revisiting decisions is framed as weakness. Silence becomes the preferred response. Hollywood's reaction to the trial demonstrated this clearly. There was no collective reckoning, no open acknowledgement of premature action, no meaningful discussion about how future cases should be handled differently. The system absorbed the shock and returned to form. That return is telling. It suggests that exposure alone is not enough. Public trials can illuminate behavior, but they do not automatically reform incentives. The same forces that rewarded speed over care remained intact, and those forces will act again. This is why focusing only on the verdict misses the point. The verdict mattered to the people involved, but the larger story was about process, about how easily lives can be altered by accusation alone, about how institutions protect themselves first and individuals last. The darkest part of the game is not malice. It is indifference. Indifference to long-term harm. Indifference to repair. Indifference to the human cost of being wrong. Johnny Depp's case forced a rare pause. It slowed the machinery just enough for people to see it working. But once the trial ended, the machinery did not stop. It simply recalibrated. This is the uncomfortable truth the trial exposed. Justice in public does not guarantee justice in practice. Visibility does not guarantee fairness. And silence, once again, proved to be the system's most reliable shield. What remains is a question the industry has yet to answer honestly. How many lives have been reshaped by narratives that were never fully examined? And how many more will be unless the incentives change? That question lingers beyond this case, and it is far more unsettling than any verdict. Even after exposure, the system did not slow itself down. It rarely does. Systems built on speed and insulation interpret exposure not as a signal to change, but as a problem to manage. Hollywood watched the trial closely, not to learn, but to calculate. The question was never, what did we get wrong? It was, what does this mean for risk going forward? That distinction explains why reform is so rare. Industries that operate on reputation do not reward reflection. Reflection implies uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens stability. Stability, financial, legal, brand-based, is protected at all costs. So when a public trial exposes flaws in how decisions were made, the response is not accountability, it is adjustment. Quiet adjustment. Language becomes more careful. Contracts become more flexible. Exit clauses become more aggressive. Internal policies are rewritten to protect institutions from backlash, not to protect individuals from premature judgment. The underlying behavior remains the same. This is why the trial felt so unsettling to watch. Not because it revealed new cruelty, but because it revealed how normalized that cruelty already was. The machinery did not need villains. It ran smoothly on incentives alone. Another reason reform is resisted is precedent anxiety. If institutions openly acknowledge that they acted too quickly, they open the door to liability, legal, reputational, financial. Apologies create records. Admissions invite claims. Silence avoids both. So silence becomes policy. This is not conspiracy. It is standard risk management. But risk management has a human cost. By refusing to revisit decisions, the system communicates something clearly. Damage is acceptable as long as it is not traceable, as long as it is diffuse, as long as it can be framed as unfortunate rather than wrong. This creates a culture where early action is rewarded and correction is punished. The Johnny Depp trial challenged this culture by forcing a rare confrontation between process and consequence. But the confrontation was temporary. Once the cameras left, the incentives snapped back into place. Hollywood does not evolve through exposure. It evolves through pressure. And pressure only works when it is sustained. One of the most revealing aspects of the aftermath was what didn't happen. There was no industry-wide conversation about due process, no public commitment to delaying judgment, no acknowledgement that moral certainty had been replaced by market logic. Instead, the silence returned. Silence allows everyone to move on without changing behavior. It preserves ambiguity, it avoids precedent, and it keeps power centralized. This is why the darkest part of the game persists even after being seen. Because the game is not built on individual decisions. It is built on structure. And structures do not feel shame. They respond only to incentives. Another reason reform stalls is cultural polarization. The trial became a proxy battle for larger ideological conflicts. People stopped discussing process and started defending sides. Once that happened, the opportunity for systemic reflection collapsed. Any critique of early judgment was framed as hostility toward victims. Any call for due process was framed as moral weakness. That framing is powerful. It discourages nuance. It punishes restraint. And it makes institutions even more risk-averse because stepping into that debate carries reputational danger, so they stay out. This retreat reinforces the same behavior that caused the problem in the first place, allowing public narrative to dictate action instead of evidence. The trial also revealed how little space exists for re-entry once someone has been removed. Even after public scrutiny, even after testimony, even after legal outcomes, the path back is unclear. Doors do not automatically reopen. Trust is not automatically restored. Why? Because restoration requires admission that removal may have been premature, and that admission is more threatening to institutions than prolonged ambiguity. So the burden remains on the individual to rebuild, to rebrand, to reprove worth, often without acknowledgement that the system failed them first. This asymmetry is fundamental. The system makes the error. The individual pays the price. The system moves on unchanged. That is the darkest game the trial exposed. Not malicious intent, but structural indifference. And that indifference survives exposure because it is efficient. Johnny Depp's case briefly disrupted the rhythm. It slowed decisions. It forced questions. It created hesitation where there had been reflex. But disruption is not the same as reform. Once the moment passed, the incentives remained. The lesson Hollywood learned was not wait for facts. It was manage optics more carefully. That is a crucial difference. Managing optics does nothing to protect truth. It only protects institutions from backlash. And as long as that is the priority, the same outcomes will repeat under different names, different faces, different headlines. The trial pulled back the curtain. It showed how reputations are handled, how silence is weaponized, how distance replaces dialogue. But exposure without accountability becomes spectacle. And spectacle, once consumed, is quickly forgotten. This is why the question the trial leaves behind is not about guilt or innocence. It is about architecture, about whether systems built for speed can ever coexist with justice, about whether moral language will continue to be used as cover for risk avoidance, about whether anyone will be willing to slow down when slowing down feels dangerous. So far, the answer appears to be no, which means the conditions that made this case possible still exist. They are waiting. In the end, the Johnny Depp trial was never just about two people in conflict. It was about visibility colliding with power, and what happens when a system designed to operate quietly is forced into the open. What the trial exposed was not a conspiracy. It was something far more unsettling. A structure where accusation outruns investigation, where silence is safer than discernment, where institutions protect themselves first and ask questions later, if at all. Hollywood did not fail because it chose the wrong side. It failed because it chose speed over process, because it treated uncertainty as danger instead of as a reason to pause, because it allowed narrative to stand in for truth. And once narrative takes control, correction becomes almost impossible. Johnny Depp's case showed how little protection due process offers once reputational damage has already settled. By the time evidence is examined, careers have shifted, relationships have dissolved, and public perception has hardened. Even when facts surface, they arrive into an environment that has already moved on. Justice, when delayed, rarely repairs. The trial forced people to witness how reputations are not destroyed by verdicts, but by anticipation, by institutions acting on what might be true rather than what is true, by silence that allows harm to occur without accountability. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: the system worked exactly as designed. It insulated brands, it minimized liability, it avoided admissions. What it did not do was protect the human being caught inside it. This is why the game continues even after being exposed, because exposure alone does not change incentives. Systems do not evolve from discomfort. They evolve from pressure that refuses to dissipate. Once the trial ended, Hollywood did what it always does. It absorbed the moment and returned to form. No reckoning, no public reform, just quieter calculations. That silence is not ignorance. It is strategy. And it tells us something essential. Unless incentives change, this will happen again. Different names, different accusations, same machinery. The lesson here is not to ignore allegations, it is to refuse replacement of process with performance, to understand that belief and investigation are not the same thing, and that justice without patience is not justice at all. Johnny Depp's trial did not resolve Hollywood's darkest game, it revealed it. And once revealed, the responsibility shifts. Not just to institutions, but to audiences, to question speed, to demand rigor, to resist certainty before evidence. Because the most dangerous systems are not the ones hidden in shadows. They are the ones operating openly, normalized, and unchallenged. If this story changed how you see trials, accusations, and power, not as moments, but as mechanisms, then it has done its job. For more long-form documentaries that expose how narrative, reputation, and silence shape modern power, stay with this channel. Subscribe for stories that go deeper than headlines. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And share this video with someone who still believes exposure alone leads to reform. Because until the incentives change, the game will keep playing itself.